Live from the palatial studios at Emerson College in beautiful downtown Boston, this is the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. Rebuilding America, together, investing, activism, and supporting the middle class. Now, here's Jeff.
Thank you, Shane, and good afternoon, Americans, and welcome to the Jeff Santos Show. We are live in Studio A on the campus of Emerson College. It is great to be with you on this 29th of March, 2016. We got a great show for you today. Started off with our great Seattle correspondent, Mark Taylor-Canfield. A fantastic job covering the elections on Twitter and Facebook and throughout the independent magazines and journalism in the Pacific Northwest. We'll get his take on how Bernie blew out the competition. Secretary Clinton in the Pacific Northwest, primarily in Washington State, but also doing well in Alaska and Hawaii. Starts us off at 3:34 Eastern. Coming up at 4:06, we'll talk about education, public education, and we'll talk with our friends at Badass Teachers. Marla Kilfoyle will join us, and joining Miss Kilfoyle will be a candidate for legislature in the great Empire State of New York, which, of course, the presidential campaign is coming to over the coming weeks. So we'll get a kind of a two-for with our friend Miss Kilfoyle. Coming up at 4:34, we'll talk to Jonathan Jackson. He, of course, the son of Jessie Jackson, has endorsed Mr. Sanders for president. We'll talk about the goals for the Sanders campaign in the African-American community, primarily, and as you go east to New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and cities like that, Washington, D.C. suburbs and Maryland, and how we look at a different perspective than what Sanders has achieved thus far, although he did do much better in Michigan. We'll see in Milwaukee. We'll talk to Earl Ingram later this week, by the way, of course, African-American, to former talk show host out of Milwaukee, get his perspectives on that issue. Coming up at 5 o'clock, we'll talk to Jonathan Tasini, the author of the book, Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. He'll give us a perspective also as a native New Yorker about what is likely in that Empire State. Senator Clinton, or Secretary Clinton, leads by quite a substantial margin. We'll see if there are avenues. We'll get Jonathan's perspective on that at 5:06. And then Robert Kraig wraps it up at 5:34 from Wisconsin. We'll get all of the latest with him, what is happening with Mr. Trump. The news today, of course, breaking that both Governor Walker endorsing Ted Cruz was the early morning breaking news, although not surprising. Everybody kind of expected it. And the guy's at 39% approval rating, so I don't know how much he can swing over to Ted Cruz. But the bigger news, which has been dominating the landscape of two of the three networks, the FOX network, not to include it because they're in their own planet, but the network that begins with M and the network that begins with C have been all over the breaking news of Corey Ledowski, the campaign manager for Donald Trump, is facing assault charges in Florida, in the Palm Beach County area, where the, of course, Donald Trump's palatial estate is located, for pushing and pulling the arm of a reporter. And they have videotape from the ballroom that has that. So far, the Trump people are behind their campaign manager, who, by the way, is from Massachusetts and has some roots not far from here in the Boston metropolitan area. So we will find out more about that and what effect it will have on Wisconsin with our good friend Robert Kraig, again, executive director of Citizen Action Wisconsin. All this, plus your phone calls at 772-925-8206. Welcome back. It is the Jeff Santos Show. 34 minutes past the hour. Phone number to join us, 772-925-8206. It's time we go to the West Coast, talk to our friends in the great city of Seattle. He is, of course, a great independent journalist. You can catch him on Daily Kos. He has been all over Twitter on these last few days, doing a great job covering the presidential primary. Mark Taylor-Canfield joins us. You're a busy man, Mark.
Yes, well, I blame Bernie Sanders. He's got everybody reporting on him up here in Seattle. He's a rock star. I mean, you can't go anywhere without seeing a Bernie Sanders sign. I even went to the cover of the Securicon at Washington State Convention Center, and you had cosplay girls out there with "I'm for Bernie Sanders" signs. So he's kind of infiltrated everywhere. It's Bernie Sanders phenomena is incredible, Jeff. I have never seen anything like it. I've never seen a city get so excited about a presidential candidate in my lifetime, that's for sure. It's amazing.
Well, it was interesting to watch the Safeco event. People gathered around, the Safeco event. I'm not sure if people were not allowed in because of the Secret Service. You have to go through the monitors and so forth. But we saw for at least 3 or 4 hours, and I know that you were there at around 1 o'clock or so in the afternoon on Friday. It was amazing. 30,000 people, and you still really couldn't, I think, probably see it as much from the people, 15,000 what was reported, but it seemed like there was even more that were there. Give us an of what that was like. Usually candidates don't rent baseball stadiums. They can't fill them. But he came pretty close, or at least halfway there. What was that whole thing like?
It was like a rock concert. It was, there were bands that opened. Local band Taco Cat opened the show with some really good rock and roll. The crowd was so enthusiastic that during the breaks they were doing the wave, and people were chanting and singing and dancing. There was so much excitement in the stadium. It was like, I don't know, the Beatles were in town or something. It was crazy. It was like Shea Stadium. People were just full of excitement. And yes, there was heavy security, but it was a good crowd. People were happy. They were glad to be there. There was a lot of media there. You could barely see past the risers with all of the cameras from folks from all over the world covering this event. And I've just never seen anything like it. I also have to give a shout out to John Poppin, who's an amazing blues harmonica player. He brought the crowd to their feet. It was a standing ovation for John Poppin with his incredible virtuoso harmonica playing. And yeah, it was more of a celebration, I think, than a campaign. It was more about, thank God Bernie Sanders is in the race, and thank God that we have someone to vote for here who seems to be an authentic candidate who really does represent the majority of the people. It was really exciting, Jeff. I was there with a camera person from Brazil who was doing my photojournalism, and she was literally brought to tears by Bernie Sanders, which is very rare to see, someone in the journalism circle being that moved by a political candidate.
Wow.
We tend to be a little cynical and skeptical about all this stuff, but he was really touching.
The jaded media, yes, indeed. Well, let me ask you, because this to me is whether or not we are seeing a movement move east toward first Wisconsin and then to the northeast, and we'll be talking to Jonathan Jackson, Jessie Jackson's son, and of course who's endorsed Bernie Sanders, and then later Jonathan Tasini, who is a author of the book Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America, a little bit later. But I'm wondering, I would imagine that he would win the Oregon primary coming up. I guess that's in May. Hands down, it should be a huge win for Bernie, and I think he will do very well in California too. But do you, having lived in the West Coast, do you sense that and I think that, Bernie has said it, the most progressive part of America, having lived out there, having spent some time in the Pacific Northwest myself, I don't have any doubt that they're more progressive than we are here in the Northeast. Do you think that the politics of Bernie Sanders, does it translate to the young people on the East Coast as much as it does on the West? And what is the difference, if you could tell our audience here in the Boston area and, of course, across the country, and particularly in the East Coast?
Well, there were a few things that really shocked me. One was the amount of support that he received in very rural counties in eastern Washington, where they're heavily Republican occupied territory, so to speak. And one of my theories on that was that, a lot of the Hillary Clinton folks and the Democrats have sort of given up on a few of those counties. So who's going to do the organizing but the new influx of young people in the Democratic Party? Who is going to bring those people together? It's going to be the Bernie Sanders campaign, not the Hillary Clinton campaign. I literally was rechecking the results from the New York Times, trying to make sure that they hadn't made a mistake, because I had not expected such a large victory. I was thinking, 20-25% would be amazing. And what struck me also was I talked to a few Bernie Sanders campaign workers who were very young, and they were saying, "Oh, but we were hoping for 80%." So they're shooting, for they're pie in the sky. I mean, they're shooting for a huge Bernie Sanders takeover of the West Coast. I've been talking to folks from Oregon. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm for him down there. He's been packing venues in Portland the same way he has been in Seattle. He packed them in Spokane. People were waiting in line once again in Spokane to see him, and then to see what happened in Alaska and Hawaii is just really amazing. I think there's a huge influx of new people into the party on the West Coast. A lot of people who have never been Democrats before, many of them who've never voted before, and certainly have never taken place in a caucus. During the town hall precinct caucuses, one of the volunteers told me that he estimated 3,000 people showed up at Seattle Town Hall to caucus. They literally had to have some of the caucus outside of the building. And Town Hall is a very large venue. I don't know how many people it can actually fit, but the fact that they couldn't even fit the amount of people that were wanting to be delegates into that building was also amazing. So I think there's a wave going on. It's a sense of momentum that he's really moving on the West Coast. And yes, I expect Oregon and California to be very favorable to Bernie Sanders. So it's Bernie, as some of the campaign folks told me here from Washington, from the Washington State Democratic Party, Washington is definitely a Bernie Sanders state. Obviously, Alaska is as well. We're, headed out there by Tulsi Gabbard and Alaska. So I expect the same thing from Oregon and California. I think the West Coast has got a lot of young voters who maybe are not quite as taken in by the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. There's less of an institutional feeling to Democratic politics on the West Coast. It's a lot more wide open. And I just keep thinking over and over again, Jeff, that this is much bigger than the Democratic Party. This is a pro-democracy movement that goes way beyond the usual political divides. I've talked to people from all sorts of different political, religious, philosophical backgrounds, and I've seen people supporting Bernie Sanders that I never thought I would ever see join the Democratic Party. You've got anarchists joining, you've got socialists joining, you've got independents joining, conservatives joining. So I think it's a surprise even to the people in the Bernie Sanders campaign that he's doing so well here. And it just seems like the young folks are the ones that are driving this. It's definitely a lot of new people that are just seeing Bernie Sanders as somebody worth supporting, and maybe they haven't seen that in their lifetimes before. So they're very excited about presidential politics right now, and that's a very new, rare thing even for the West Coast. It's pretty incredible. I've never seen anything like it, and I'm not at a loss for words, as you can tell. A lot of times when people ask me.
Yeah. No, you obviously have spent a number of hours on this show, at the very least, giving us your perspective. When we come back from the break, though, I want to talk to you, Mark, about how he has motivated people here, and how he can get new voters to continue to work for him, get them to vote, to campaign. And I think it's going to be fascinating as we come back and discuss this. Wisconsin, a week from today. New York, 3 weeks from today. Fascinating stuff. We're right back with Mark Taylor-Canfield. 49 minutes past the hour. It is the Jeff Santos Show. Talking with our good friend, Mark Taylor-Canfield from the West Coast. Mark, one of the issues that has come out of the focus on the Seattle primary or the Washington State primary is the issue of superdelegates, some 17 who have committed to Secretary Clinton. That would be kind of an injustice, to say the least, after blowing out Secretary Clinton, Senator Sanders' campaign. What's the latest on that?
Well, out of 118 delegates, 17 of them had already supported Hillary Clinton. In the Alaska caucus and in the Hawaii preference poll, it wasn't much of a factor because there weren't that many delegates and there weren't that many superdelegates that had supported Hillary Clinton. But when you have a state where he is polling 70% of the vote, even in rural counties, and Hillary Clinton couldn't get over 40% in any county in Washington State, it's pretty clear that 17 delegates committed to Hillary Clinton as superdelegates does not represent the caucus results. And so there is a lot of pressure coming from the Bernie Sanders campaign, especially a lot of the young volunteers saying these superdelegates have got to change their vote. If they want to show the world that this is a democratic process within the Democratic Party, it is called the Democratic Party after all, then they are going to need to reflect that. And there's a process going on right now where there are statewide delegates that have already been allocated, but then there's another level where congressional district, they're going to be allocated by congressional districts. There's two more series of events that are going to happen in Washington State on the legislative district level, congressional level, and then the state level. And during that process, I think a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters are hoping that these superdelegates will rethink this endorsement of Hillary Clinton and do the right thing, which would be to support Bernie Sanders and truly represent the vote in Washington State. So I don't think that pressure is going to go away, and it would be the right thing to do. There's no reason why 17 delegates should go automatically to Hillary Clinton when she could not win one single county in Washington State. That's very indicative of what's happening here. It's not a Hillary Clinton state. It's a Bernie Sanders state, and they really need to represent that if they want to retain the legitimacy of this process. I, as a journalist, I can say that I agree with that assessment.
Talking with Mark Taylor-Canfield here on the Jeff Santos Show. I mean, it would seem to me that, and we've talked 100 times about this already, that the media, and by the way, let me give a shout out to MSNBC. They carried it live, and that was a good thing. But in a Safeco event on Friday evening, that is. But they
Although
still...
I have to interrupt, Jeff. I think that they underestimated the crowd size. I really do. There were more than 15,000 people there. Half the...
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the exactly. I mean, if it holds 40 or 45,000 people, there is at least 20, 25 there, in my opinion. So, and again, how many people who were not, involved in getting in were outside? So there's a whole slew of people here. This, to me, why they didn't really do a really good job. I mean, although, again, I give them credit for actually bringing this to the American people live. Let me ask you, though, did the young people that you saw there for Bernie, are they planning on going to Wisconsin or going to other states? Do they plan to go south to Oregon and eventually to California? What are you hearing about their involvement besides the voting and besides campaigning, the Washington State Brigade, if you might?
Well, it's not something that I've done a lot of reporting about, but just my impression is that the social networking mediums are being used very well by folks in the Northwest. When they're out there tweeting about Bernie Sanders on constantly 24 hours a day, a lot of that is a national audience. It's not just the Northwest, and it's certainly not just Washington State. So yes, of course, they will have an influence on the rest of the country. There's Seattle especially, but a lot of the Northwest has become a very high-tech sort of oriented region. And so these younger folks are definitely well-versed in using social networking in order to spread the news. And as I would also assume that as folks on the East Coast and in the Midwest, especially the younger new voters, see the kind of landslide that he's getting on the West Coast, that's automatically going to have an influence. You want to be with the winner, of course. That's politics.
Right, of course. Momentum.
You see Alaska when Alaska goes 80% for Bernie Sanders, that's a sign to the rest of the country that, this is a real contender here. He is a contender, to quote the famous boxing movie. And I think that he's, that influence from the Northwest will spread across the rest of the country. There's no doubt that we all have friends and family and colleagues in the rest of the country that we're talking to constantly, and that enthusiasm is definitely being shared with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. I mean, he's also receiving a lot of coverage from international media, and so it's a meme that's moving. It's got legs, as they say, Jeff, in the world of journalism. The Bernie Sanders phenomena is not going to go away. There's nothing that the Democratic Party can do or the Republicans do to stop this juggernaut. It is huge. It is definitely huge, and it is reflecting sort of a new sense of politics. A lot of the conversations that I had with folks who are new to the political process are like this. They're saying this is the future. These issues like the $15 an hour minimum wage, which was just approved by the California governor and state legislature, it is the future. These issues of legalization of marijuana, these economic issues, this more...
Mark, before... I don't want to cut you off, but talk to me. Will Jim McDermott, who's leaving, of course, he's a progressive, will he come out and endorse Bernie after all this? I mean, to me, the fact that he endorsed Hillary was obviously lack of judgment, I think, going forward. But now that he's announced he's not running, I mean, do you anticipate him or any of the other leaders? I mean, I know Murray is probably not going to do it, or Cantwell, but, would Murray do it? In the mayor, that is, of Seattle, or McDermott or anyone else?
I'm really not sure what to say about that. They do seem to feel pretty entrenched in this pro-Hillary position. I can comment on what's happening in some of the labor unions here, and that definitely reflects a split. There's a lot of the rank and file who are saying that they're questioning their own leadership in terms of this Hillary Clinton support. So I can only imagine that that's also happening in the Democratic Party. I mean, he's of course retiring, but if other candidates want the support of this new block of voters in the Democratic Party, then it would be incumbent upon them to recognize his popularity in this area and yes, support him.
Is Murray or Cantwell up this time around?
Really going on. I'm sorry?
Is Murray or Cantwell up this upcoming 16? Are they both out?
Yes. If I understood your question correctly, the answer is yes. It's going to be pressure.
Mark, we got to run. I appreciate it, my friend. All the best. We're right back. Oh, yeah. The Sanders campaign on fire. And one of their top lieutenants is with us today. He, of course, is not a fan of this, not only a great fan of the music that we're playing, but he's the son of Reverend Jessie Jackson, a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, and a frequent contributor to the Jeff Santos Show. It's great to have Jonathan Jackson back on the program with us. Jonathan, Bernie Sanders on fire, my friend. You must be a happy surrogate these days. How are you, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. I've been happy all along. We could absolutely see that he was moving in this direction. And, he's had a slow start, but he's having a strong finish. And so, go Bernie, go.
We echo your thoughts. It was a great night. We talked to one of the reporters out in Washington State. Said he's seen nothing like it with the Bernie Sanders big event at Safeco Field, where the Seattle Mariners baseball team plays, and of course, just huge wins in places like Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. Of course, Hawaii, very diverse state, very big Asian population, and Bernie won overwhelmingly, over 70%. And that takes me to the question about how Bernie Sanders will continue to build not only upon that, but upon Michigan, and even in places where he lost narrowly in Illinois and Missouri. That is getting a bigger chunk of the African-American community. You've been around it all your life through your dad's campaigns and others. Talk to me about how you think it will change in terms of numbers, increasing numbers for Sanders in the African-American community.
Well, that's a great question. I think the press has been so unfair to Senator Sanders that he has not had a problem with the African-American community. The press has given him a blackout as far as news coverage, that his history in civil rights speaks for itself. His issues are being against the war, having worked with Reverend Martin Luther King, even when he first showed the video of him being arrested, having been handcuffed next to an African-American woman, and Mr. Lewis and others questioned if that were Bernie Sanders. So, of course, no one looks the same as they did from 50 years ago. But going strategically into Super Tuesday to discredit him, and the press not immediately rebuking that, I thought that was shameful. So his numbers, every state continued to increase in the African-American community. Keep in mind, he's been running full-time for 11 months. The Clintons have been running for 28 years. Bernie Sanders comes out of an independent tradition. He is the longest-serving independent in American history. So when we go to these rallies, conspicuously absent are any of the Democratic Party officials. So he's not receiving the endorsement of Democratic governors, senators, congressional leaders. He's going straight to the grassroots and not with the traditional sources of funds. So he's now passing her, running on the outside lap while she's on the inside track.
Well, that's the thing, and of course, your father's campaign, to me is an example of being the outsider. He didn't have, in fact, it was Bernie Sanders was one of the very few white political elected officials who endorsed your dad, and that I don't think has been out there enough telling people about this. In 1988, as you know, we're not that different in age, is a lot different in how African Americans were perceived and how African American candidates. This is 20 years before Barack Obama, and I think that a lot of people don't understand what it was like for Senator Sanders to endorse Reverend Jackson at that time, and you've been around obviously both gentlemen and understand what it meant back then. Your dad was on this show just a few weeks ago, talked about the fact that it took a lot of guts, a lot of cojones is my word, to do that. And I think we need to see more entrenched politicians in the Democratic Party come out for Senator Sanders and show some equal cojones to do this, because obviously a lot of people are tied to the established candidates back in '88 and again in 2016. Your thoughts?
Well, you're correct. And to think that a young white student from Brooklyn and then later on in Vermont from Brooklyn would come to the University of Chicago and be handcuffed with an African-American woman and willing to go to jail to break up segregated housing in the city of Chicago on the South Side. That's courage, and that's who Mr. Sanders was then. And many African-American leaders also shunned Reverend Martin Luther King in 1963. Senator Sanders stood with him then, while others said that it wasn't politically expedient thing to do. He did it because it was the right thing. And in 1984 and 1988, he was the only mayor, white mayor in the country that endorsed my father's candidacy. When my father was not an office holder, he was an African-American minister, was coming to Burlington, Vermont, and I remember meeting Mr. Sanders there, and he supported us in 1988. And in 2008, he didn't run against President Obama. He had laid the path and the groundwork for Mr. Obama to be accepted and received in the New England states. And so he's always been about racial justice, a more compassionate America, anti-war. So I look at him not as a politician, but as a true American statesman. And that's why I'm so excited about his candidacy. And he's a man of courage, of his conviction. And so to that, he gives us somebody to look up to.
Talking with Jonathan Jackson, again, surrogate for Bernie Sanders here on the Jeff Santos Show. You have a number, of course, big cities coming up, not only with New York, you have Philadelphia and Baltimore, and some of the suburbs in Maryland that, of course, surround the Washington, D.C. corridor. It would seem to me that there are a number of African American leaders who should understand if their challenges and what it took for them to get elected to Congress or to get elected to Senate or just in politics in general, with the institutional racism that has been part not only of the Democratic Party but obviously still is in the Republican Party, and that they would understand the outside campaign. The outsider against establishment, against the Wall Street, they would understand that there is a need for this kind of champion in the White House that they can partner with to get a lot of things done. Your thoughts there?
Well, unfortunately, even when you get African Americans on the police force and they can witness wrongdoing, unfortunately, over time, they don't look at themselves as the African-American policemen that can bring some cultural sensitivity and diversity to the force. They go by code blue and look at themselves as officers first. And I think that many of these elected officials can fall into that same trap as looking at themselves as Democratic Party members and can lose their way on really being aligned with the people and the messaging and the need for the moment for their constituents. And one of the things that Mr. Sanders is also confronting is that we really have one party with two names. The same people that are giving to the big donor Democrats are the same ones that are the big donor Republicans. They're giving to both, and he's rejected both parts of that. So he's really in a lane by himself and in a class by himself at this time.
One of the things we talked about, when it comes to Senator Sanders' campaign is that he has talked a lot about putting a lot of money into infrastructure. In fact, conversation with your dad would like even a bigger number than what Senator Sanders is doing. But I think that the idea of infrastructure should not be lost on the focus of how you can help the inner cities of this country. Talk to me about this in the final 1 minute of this segment, Jonathan.
Well, infrastructure has a lot to deal with city planning on where we'll live, work, and where we'll get educated. And so when you talk about building rail lines so that you can have mass transit, which is the link between welfare and work, having access to transportation, having schools and communities that are lead-free and asbestos-free. There are 99 other cities in America that have lead pipe poisoning as well, which go on to create ADHD, dementia, Alzheimer, and other things.
Right back with Jonathan Jackson after this timeout. 49 minutes past the hour. Another great voice here on the Jeff Santos Show.
There you go.
Talking with our good friend Jonathan Jackson on the show. I would love to find out how much of all of these music pieces are in his iPhone or iPod. Talking with the surrogate for the Bernie Sanders campaign. We'll talk to Jonathan Tasini about the upcoming New York primary as well. Another Sanders surrogate. New York, so big you have to say it twice, right? Well, this is going to be an issue here where we're going to find out whether or not the Clinton campaign is going to hold to their promise of another debate and one in the state of New York. Now, you have a situation here where one person who was born there and who's been a fighter for those who grew up in tenements like he did, and who fights for the folks in Buffalo and in Syracuse and in all parts of the difficult and the places that not Wall Street executives and those from the businesses of Midtown Manhattan, frequent, but from the people who are barely making it by. And need the single-payer health care that Senator Sanders has, and need the 4 years of free university at public universities. There is a huge two cities here of New York, two states of New York. Those who have done very well, 1/10 of the 1%. We all know Wall Street lays there at the bottom of Manhattan. And there are a lot of people who are taking a lot of money, including a lot of officials in the Democratic Party and obviously in the Republican Party. Talk to me about the two different sides. It's not only New York, it's Illinois, where you are, or it's California, and a lot of states in this country, but New York is coming up soon.
I think people really need to digest how extraordinary a campaign that Mr. Sanders is running. He has opted not to have a super PAC and not to court the party big dollar donors. So you can go to Billionaires Row in Manhattan and pick up $1 million to fund your super PAC or to supercharge your campaign. He's opted to take $27 from individuals. It would take you 37,000 people at $27 in order to have $1 million. He's gone about this the hardest, most righteous way. And he wants to represent the little man from Brooklyn, from Pennsylvania, the working man, because he understands that the people that pay your bills are the ones that you are ultimately beholden to. And in the last 11 months, something rather miraculous has happened. He's been able to get enough little bitty rocks, if you will. I think of him like David throwing rocks at a Goliath, and he's been very successful. There are, I believe, 16 more states to go, big states like Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Maryland,
California,
and Oregon. And so Bernie has run this with the utmost of integrity. And I do believe, and I hope that you are pushing, and we've got to believe that Ms. Clinton will honor her word and agree to the New York debate. I mean, it's what she said. It's what she agreed to. It's what Mr. Sanders was willing to accommodate. Do you think she would back out on her word?
Look, I mean, politicians have a way of fudging the truth and moving around, the word. Well, we promised it. Well, I'm afraid to tell you, Jonathan, that there are a lot of political figures in the Democratic Party, including Secretary Clinton, who don't necessarily say exactly what they mean. And then, of course, they say, oh, well, we'll do it in Pennsylvania instead of New York. They don't want to do it without, Mr. Sanders and his campaign being softer. I don't know if this is a nod to sort of the kinder, gentler approach. So, though I guess people may not look at that if you're David Brock or the people who are the Hillary Clinton surrogates, and the PAC, the super PAC that she has, all from Wall Street, of course. So I'm afraid, Jonathan, that it's not that clear right now that you will have a debate in New York.
I certainly hope she will honor her word, because, you've got so many young people that have been inspired by Senator Sanders, and one thing that they certainly appreciate about him is his veracity, his truthfulness, his consistency over a time, and I would really not want to see them disappointed. And we owe that to the young people that are first-time voters that are excited about getting involved in the process.
Well, there is. There are a number of young people who, in my opinion, are in New York City, are in the state of New York, a lot of universities in the state of New York, and they want to be able to make a difference between the former senator of New York State, Secretary Clinton, who, of course, was Senator Clinton from 2001 until 2009, and and of course somebody like Bernie Sanders, who grew up in a tenement. And by the way, his wife is also from Brooklyn as well, so it's a family affair for the Sanders family. And I think people want to see the differences, so why not have a debate?
Well, I think it's going to be very exciting, and I think that Mr. Sanders is going back into his home turf, and I think he gets stronger every day. His voice is clear, and he's got the resources now. He started out in the hole. He didn't launch with the party officials endorsing him. He's gone about this the old-fashioned way. And to think that he's filled up Conseco Field, and I've seen him fill up Ohio State, I've seen him do this in Charlotte, and to see that the press does not cover that event that happened in Washington State took place in 48 hours. You fill up a baseball stadium.
Yeah,
48 hours.
We talked to Mark,
a headline musician or entertainer. Phenomenal. It shows that the young people are hungry, and the workers, they want to have a fair deal.
There's no doubt. And one of the things you be coming to New York, and we're hoping to be there too. Erica Gardner, of course, Eric Gardner's daughter. And her issues, the issues of police abuse that you talked about, mentioned, and Bernie Sanders has talked about. If you can, in our final seconds here, give me your thoughts about how this issue in places like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, of course, which also saw the death of Mr. McDonald. Hopefully these issues can be talked about in the campaign, and there's no better place than to do it as in the New York debate. Final 60 seconds, all yours, Jonathan.
Well, Senator Sanders also did it here in Chicago, where Laquan McDonald was killed, a teenager shot 16 times, 17 years of age, and the city had covered it up. And he's had a career of standing on the right side. His ideas on judicial reform and to ending mass incarceration, he has refused to accept private prison lobbyist money, unlike his opponent, Mrs. Clinton, that he is truly a man of his word and his character. We are the most incarcerated nation on planet Earth. He finds that to be a disgrace.
Jonathan Jackson.
It's not taking place in Vermont.
Thank you so very much. We'll talk to you very soon, my friend. All the best. And for those of you who are listening to us online or on radio, AM 980 WCAP, we ask you to continue to talk, continue to listen. You can give us a call at 772-925-8206. Stay tuned. We'll talk to another Jonathan Tasini. He's written a book on Bernie Sanders. We'll get the New York perspective. Jonathan's a New York native. We're right back. It's the Jeff Santos Show. Don't go anywhere. It is hour 3 of the Jeff Santos Show. A little Rolling Stones for you. Phone number to join us, 772-925-8206. Well, we gave you Jonathan Jackson in the last hour, Sanders surrogate. Now we're going to give you Jonathan Tasini, another Sanders surrogate, a native New Yorker, and, of course, author of the great book, Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. Great to have you back on, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm good, although I'm not quite a native New Yorker, but I have lived here for 30-plus years, so that qualifies. At least I've lived here longer than Hillary Clinton. Let me put it that way.
There you go. Well done. Well, I have a lot of questions for you, but you must be a very, very happy Sanders surrogate after the weekend that he just had, a blowout in 3 states, including the great state of Washington, Hawaii, where it's a very diverse population, of course, and the great state of Alaska. Your thoughts about what this does and the momentum that it creates for Sanders' campaign 2016?
Well, I would say 2 things. First, it reaffirms what Jeff Weaver, Tad Devine, all Bernie's senior people have said, is that after March 15th, the calendar was going to turn much more friendly to Bernie, and I think that was proven on Saturday. And we are going to start doing quite well in the same way. We've won 6 of the last 7 contests. And second, more important, we cut significantly into the delegate lead that Hillary Clinton has. It's now down to 240 delegates, I believe. I'm not looking at my math at the moment because I'm walking around on the road here. But we basically closed the gap by 80-plus delegates, and that's going to increase because, just quickly on the Washington state, there's still 2 more levels of voting to go. It's a very complicated caucus system. But I think we're going to pick up a handful more delegates when all said is done in Washington.
Well, no doubt. It is a huge day for a huge week for the Sanders campaign. And he's now won 5 of the last 6. He goes into the Great Badger State with some momentum. I would guess that the campaign is geared up for the Badger State and obviously getting ready to return home. That, of course, the home of Bernie Sanders and his wife, Jane, Brooklyn, New York. Talk to me about the upcoming race of Wisconsin and what you think you'll be hearing a lot of. Bernie Sanders is a big guy on trade, which should be a big issue there in Wisconsin. And obviously, we'll get to New York in a second, too.
Yeah, so there's Wisconsin, in between there's little old Wyoming, and then you're right, we come to New York on April 19th. I think we're going to do quite well in Wisconsin. I think we're going to win Wisconsin, and in fact, we may win by a very big margin, so we'll get a big haul of delegates there. It's, there's pockets in Wisconsin that are quite progressive. Madison, leaps to mind right away. Milwaukee. And the state in itself has been, as everybody probably knows, a big battleground with Scott Walker. And I think the contrast of Bernie versus Scott Walker, a right-wing ideologue versus the most progressive candidate in the race, will certainly draw the contrast. And Bernie has no, fear or compunction of taking on Walker directly and in general establishment politics, pointing out that, as you point out, the issue of trade, which is very important in Wisconsin, and the way in which Hillary Clinton has supported all these trade agreements, essentially, going back 20 years, and Bernie has opposed them. So I think we're going to do quite well. And the energy on the ground is there. I think I'm going to be out there in a day or 2. If I don't stick around New York, I'm still sort of weighing that, but very excited about Wisconsin.
We're talking with Jonathan Tasini, of course, author of the book Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. And let me ask you, you spent the essential Bernie Sanders. My apologies.
That's okay.
I have the book right in front of me. I don't know. I just read it wrong. But let me ask you this: the thing is that a lot of people look at New York. And of course, the media is all there. It's the largest city in the country, one of the most amazing cities of the world. So you have a candidate in Bernie Sanders, and again his wife, who is from Brooklyn, and you have another candidate who is the former senator, but spent a lot of time in Washington D.C. while she was senator. And, has her headquarters in the great borough of Brooklyn as well. But there's a lot of difference between who they spend some time with, Senator Sanders, how he grew up in the 3 tenement, and Senator or Secretary Clinton, who spends a lot of time representing Wall Street. In fact, she said that in debate after debate. And, they're my constituents. There's a big difference between those who live in the 3 tenements and those who live on Wall Street.
And you got to understand, the Clintons live in a multi-million-dollar home in Chappaqua, which is Westchester County, one of the most affluent zip codes in the entire country. These people are multimillionaires. They're worth tens of millions of dollars. The notion that Hillary Clinton has any sense of what the average person goes through day to day is just false. And in fact, the most honest thing she ever said in the entire campaign was during the debate when they said to her, "Why did you take $225,000 for one speech from Goldman Sachs?" And her answer was, "Well, that's what they offered," because she didn't even think for a moment that there was something wrong with that. Because in their world, when they hang out with billionaires and they fly in private jets, $225,000 is like $100, to the average working person. I mean, to them it doesn't mean anything. It's like $5 to what we would mean. $225 grand. Bill Gates gets a lot more than that. So, but
right.
Look, she was the senator from New York for basically the bat of an eye. She did it basically to prepare to run for president. They really didn't care about New York as a whole. That said, she has most of the Democratic political establishment behind her, certainly in the 5 boroughs, and therefore, you have to be honest. She has a certain amount of resources. She'll have a lot of people, surrogates out there, beating the bushes. But I think it's also important. I'll quickly say this: that New York State is not just the 5 boroughs. There's a lot of places outside the 5 boroughs, including places like Buffalo, where Bernie's going to campaign and make the argument that bad trade agreements, which have hurt Buffalo, which Hillary Clinton has supported, are not something that people in Buffalo, which has been a city that's been really hard hit by bad trade deals.
Of course.
Not people of Buffalo don't want that. And the second thing I'll say, there's a lot of rural areas throughout the state, and because Bernie represented Vermont, he has a really good feel for dairy farmers, for the issues that small farmers confront throughout New York State.
Well, I took a train from Boston through Cleveland and into Chicago, and on the way back. And one of the things you say about Buffalo is so true. You see abandoned warehouses, a abandoned train station, one of the more beautiful structures, now just a shell of itself, the Buffalo train station, we have abandoned these cities because of these trade deals, because of the lack of investment in the inner cities.
Buffalo has lost half its population in the last sort of 25 years. It's a beautiful city, but it's kind of stunning to drive through along these big highways and boulevards that were built for a huge industrial population. And you kind of feel like, this has happened to me, you drive along and you think it's the weekend because it's so quiet, and relatively speaking, there's so few cars on the road, but that really has to do with the decline in the population, and particularly young people have abandoned Buffalo. It's quite a sad story. And Bernie, I'll say, to go back to the election, is the perfect candidate for cities like Buffalo that need someone to stand up for the workers.
No doubt, and they need it. And it's in Erie, PA, where they lost a refining company, where it's in Cleveland, Ohio, where they have lost a tremendous amount of jobs to NAFTA, and on and on and on across the borders, on south to north and east to west. Talk to me about the state of New York, in the fact that you're bringing back an individual in Bernie Sanders, to an area, a borough of Brooklyn, where again he grew up in the 3 tenements. It has been gentrified. There are now neighborhoods that were once, blighted inner city neighborhoods that were frequented by African Americans have now turned into, very much a yogurt shop, on every corner. In certain neighborhoods of Brooklyn, we know there needs to be an understanding of investing in these cities and keeping the same people there as well. And I think that this is something that Senator Sanders speaks to, in the sense of keeping communities together in the fabric that does that, whether they're providing the education in his 4 years of education or providing the fact that you don't have to decide upon rent or the mortgage and education or your health care. I think all these things go back to the fabric that has been lost, as you said, over the last 30 or 40 years. Your thoughts there?
Yes. So I would say very both generally and specifically. So generally, yes. One of the things that Bernie points out is, and New York is the perfect example, is the great disparity between rich and poor. And you don't have to go further than a few blocks around Midtown Manhattan where you see these soaring, big, huge buildings, that are sold for $60, $70, $80 million a piece for an apartment that are being bought as investments by billionaires and oligarchs from Russia or China. And that's the kind of massive wealth inequality that you can see right in the streets of New York. And at the same time, you have pockets of great poverty. You go to
Jonathan Tasini. Yeah. It's the Jeff Santos Show. "23 minutes past the hour. Donald Trump talking from his palatial plane, sticking by his man, Silodowski. What else do you expect? 23 minutes past the hour, talking here on the Jeff Santos Show with Jonathan Tasini, The Essential Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. His book, check it out, pick it up, give it to a friend. We are few minutes left here with Jonathan. Talk to me about this debate scenario. It just seems to me that you back in the early part of the campaign in early February, where Secretary Clinton went into Iowa and was facing a big deficit, Senator Sanders had said that I'll do the debate, but we want more later. And of course, Secretary Clinton agreed, but she didn't agree to New York. What's the deal with that, Jonathan?
Well, I think the thing about, I'll say a general thing, when you have no principles and when you actually have to poll test everything you say, you're always worried about making a mistake because it doesn't come from a place of honesty. And I think that's the biggest fear of the Clinton campaign, is that she's going to get asked a question and she'll say something like, well, that's what they offered me. Some line like that, which will dominate a news cycle. And so their attitude is, we don't want to debate. Bernie, of course, has been willing to debate as much as anybody wanted because he's very comfortable in what he believes, and he has no doubt what his principles are. So they are going to try to avoid as much as possible having any debate, and I don't think they're going to be able to do that because I think the press is going to be on them, the voters are going to want it. I think ultimately there will be a debate.
Do you think it'll be in the city, or do you think it'll be upstate in a place like Buffalo or Syracuse, someplace like that?
I don't know. Good question. I suspect. Well, it would be good if they did one of each. I suspect there's only going to be one, and I would guess. Well, actually, it would be just a complete guess that they'll probably do it in the city just for logistical reasons. But I could be wrong, and I'm sure that Bernie would be happy to do it anywhere they want.
That's right. Maybe Cooper Union or someplace like that. There are
bigger. Yeah.
Could be. They could do it at Madison Square Garden, I guess, too. But
not quite that big. Somewhere in between.
Yeah. Well, it's been done before. But the interesting thing in going back to what happened in Seattle is that so many young people, Jonathan, are being attracted to this campaign, and I want to get your thoughts here about the fact that 20-somethings and those maybe in their early 30s, and of course the people throughout the age groups that are for Sanders, whether you're 45 or 55 or 65, whatever. But this to me is something that is not a normal political thing. In other words, it's not one of these scenarios that come along every 4 years. People are excited, and this seems to be the most authentic. I mean, even I was only 8 years ago with Obama, but there wasn't a sort of, I think, real sense that this is a unique opportunity to change this country. And with somebody who has been there before. I mean, Barack Obama, for all his excitement of hope and change in 2008, he was catching on to something that was exciting, and maybe people were involved, but he hadn't been there. Sanders has seen this. He's been a legislator, so he understands and how to get the job done. Talk to me about the differences in these two different campaigns.
Well, they are very different, and I would say that you have a good point that, actually Bernie has done a ton of legislation. He's been an executive, a mayor. He's had far more experience than Obama had when Obama first ran. So just as based on the experience and having to push through legislation, as I said, deal with an actual executive budget, Bernie is far and away much more experienced.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is at that level where, he knows what has to be done. And, of course, the other part of this that I don't think that the media has focused too much on is that by bringing out new voters and talking to our reporter, Mark Taylor-Canfield in Seattle, you're bringing together people who have never voted before, Green Party folks, socialists, those who are libertarians, Republicans, dissatisfied with their choices, all coming together. This is a group that is going to be incredibly important in the fall, and Secretary Clinton doesn't bring those folks to the table. She brings the institutional Democratic base of those folks that are Washington focused, and that's about it. Your thoughts, finally, in the last 60 seconds here.
Yeah, all the polls show that Bernie excites people more, and particularly independents, obviously young people. And you're 100% right. If we don't bring those polls out, and I don't think she will bring them out, I actually think we have a bigger shot at losing the White House with Clinton as the nominee. But if we don't bring those people out, you don't get those swing states. So I think you're right.
Jonathan Tasini, thank you so much, my friend. The essential Bernie Sanders and his vision for America. It's important you pick it up, folks. Thank you, Jonathan. All the best.
All right, we'll be back soon. Thanks.
Thank you. 34 minutes past the hour. It is the Jeff Santos Show. We've been playing some great tunes thanks to good old Shane. I had misspoke earlier when I mentioned Baltimore. I mentioned McDonald's. Tragically enough, of course, he was in Chicago. Freddie Gray was the person I had mentioned, and apologize for that in our conversation earlier with Jonathan Jackson. But we've gone all over, from Chicago to New York, Seattle today, and we go now to where the center stage of politics is and will be for the next week, the great Badger State of Wisconsin. And, of course, when we talk about that, when we talk about our good friend every Tuesday at 5:30 Eastern Time, 4:30 Central, we talk to the Wisconsin Executive Director of Wisconsin Citizen Action. Our good friend Robert Kraig joins us. Mr. Kraig, happy Tuesday. Happy 1 week before the mania ends in Wisconsin. How are you, sir?
Very good. Good to be with you as always.
It's good to be with you, my friend. Well, you have a Republican blowing up in Mr. Trump. His polls are sagging. You have an endorsement by the former governor of his top opponent, Mr. Cruz. You have Mr. Kasich, changing his radio buys in the state of Wisconsin. And now we hear the Corey Ledowski, the campaign manager, by the way, from Massachusetts, is basically been charged with assault after trying to rip off the arm of one of the reporters from Breitbart, of all people. My God, this is getting to be more and more of a circus every day. I mean, this has turned into a reality show on steroids. What do you see it from your vantage point, Robert, on the other side of the world?
Well, it's always exciting when the circus comes to town.
There you go. There you go. Big Ten.
It's unbelievable. I mean, we had, Trump is getting protested across the state wherever he is. Latinos are protesting in Milwaukee today. So we have that going on. We have the whole Republican establishment here in Wisconsin trying to unite behind Cruz, led by Governor Walker, with his, as you point out, 39% approval rating, endorsing him today. But also yesterday, a really vile right-wing talk show host, Charlie Sykes, who actually made Scott Walker in many ways governor, did go after Trump yesterday in his interview, and even MSNBC has played that up. But that should not be understood as journalism. That is not journalism at all. What it was the Republican establishment trying to take Trump down. And of course Trump has no actual policy positions. We know that. He just utters his outcomes, and then if you ask him for a policy, he just states what he's going to accomplish. I mean, that's been the shtick the whole time.
Exactly.
And so
it's a shtick and a half.
Nothing new there.
Today. Yeah. I guess he did his press conference in his gold-plated plane earlier today, too, backing his backing his campaign manager, huh?
Well, that's just bizarre, right? And this, I haven't read the stories fully. I've just read the first couple paragraphs of several stories, but I guess I shouldn't be that careful about worrying about whether Trump has been misquoted or not. But Trump saying that his defense of his campaign manager is that if the reporter had been assaulted, she would have screamed. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I'm seeing that on Twitter from Mother Jones and from Talking Points Memo, so I guess that's the quote.
There you go.
We have a new standard for assault. You have to have screamed or be heard. I assume it's a pretty loud rally, so I don't even know how Trump knows whether she screamed or not. But aside from that, this is just more of the same. I mean, he can say things that no other politician can get away with saying. But then the Republican establishment's problem is that their alternative is Cruz, who is like beyond the pale. I mean, literally. I mean, he doesn't run a carnival act, but he's to the right of most of the most right-wing party in American history, right? So
he's Joe McCarthy reincarnated. Right. I mean, unfortunately, you know too well about that in the great Badger State, but it's the reality, and it's a sad state of affairs. Talking with our good friend Robert Kraig, Wisconsin Citizen Action, he's the executive director there. It has been a surreal time on the right wing side of things, and I'm guessing that they're trying to make sure that Cruz and Trump destroy each other, and therefore they can probably get a convention of chaos and nominate the hometown guy. In this case, it's John, and it's Governor Kasich of Ohio would be in his home state, and they can nominate him that way. But unbelievable stuff. But you have a Democratic race. We talked a couple of weeks ago that Senator Sanders is ahead by a couple of points. Some polls still show him ahead by a couple of points. Others show Secretary Clinton up by 4 or 5. But the momentum that he got from the West Coast is moving his numbers on a national level. I believe NBC News tracking poll had him as close as he's ever been in that particular poll, down by about 6 points. I think it was 49-43. And he has been ahead. Bloomberg had him ahead by 1 on a national poll. A lot of momentum for Senator Sanders. How is it looking for him today? I know there are different events going on where he's around today. What are the crowds like? What are you hearing about the momentum for Bernie Sanders?
Well, there was a huge crowd a couple days ago in Madison, which has happened before, but it was even bigger. There was a very big one in Appleton, Wisconsin today, which actually does have, a lot of these medium-sized cities in Wisconsin have very good progressive bases, which isn't really known outside of Wisconsin. So I'm not surprised that Appleton turned out in large numbers. Though there was some idiotic conceal and carry activist running around with a gun in a holster on the street that the police couldn't, because of Walker and legislature done legislature. They couldn't remove him; they just monitored him, and because he, I guess, legally had a right to do it, which is shocking. And he's going to have a big rally in Milwaukee. And Hillary was attacking him yesterday, and I think probably not the best tact. She was quoted heavily in Wisconsin media for saying that his free tuition plan is unrealistic, and saying it would cost $300 million to Wisconsin in order to do it. I just don't think that within the Democratic Party, that sort of fiscal restraint, we just can't do things like that anymore, is very inspiring. So I don't think that was exactly the way to attack him, particularly in a state that has, one of the progressive bases in the state is college students. We have one of the highest per capita college student populations in the country, and of course they're not going to be intimidated by the idea that it might cost too much to have free tuition, I don't think.
Well, in my view, you're not going to win over a lot of people. And, we saw yesterday, and I'm going to try to see if we can play this cut, Robert, from Susan Sarandon. Shane, if you can toss that into the...
despise Hillary Clinton or reject Hillary Clinton, and that should she be the nominee, which is as yet undetermined, they will walk away.
That's a legitimate concern because they're very passionate and very principled. But
isn't that crazy? If you believe in what he believes in?
Yeah, but she doesn't. She's accepted money from all those people. She doesn't even want to fight for a $15 minimum wage. So these are people that have not been, that have not come out before. So why would we think they're going to come out now for her?
You really think that?
I think there's a good possibility. I talk to people who either want to write. I talk to Republicans who have written him in already. And they just feel like she's not authentic, that she's a liar, that they don't trust her. So what difference does it make? If you're a small farmer and you're fracking on your property in Idaho, they just passed a bill where they can frack on private land.
Yeah.
And you know that she's taken money from fracking. Why would you think that she's going to have your back?
Well, because they make the argument that there are all kinds of politicians. Barack Obama is the one that Hillary Clinton cites all the time, who have done things to effectively rein in industries or reform industries that they've taken money from.
I'd like to see that. No, I don't buy it at all because she's been selling fracking all over the world. There's her talking about Monsanto and how clean, not talking about Roundup or what they put in it or what it's done to our economy. And they know that jobs are going out. Bernie doesn't voted against NAFTA, TPP or what, all these things coming up that they know affect their jobs, and she's not on the right side of that. She hasn't voted right. So what would make you think that once she gets in, she's going to suddenly go against the people that have given her millions and millions of dollars? I think that's being incredibly naive and egotistical to think suddenly she's going to see the right,
Right, but an election about choices, right? I think a lot of people.
That, of course, is, last night on Chris Hayes' show, Susan Sarandon. We'll get our good friend, Mr. Robert Kraig, to talk about it on the other side. You're listening to the Jeff Santos Show. Back in a flash. And that's where Donald Trump wants the media and the entire voting public. But I don't think it's going to happen, Mr. Trump. I don't care if you buy the Rolling Stones. It's still not going to happen. We're talking politics with Robert Kraig, Executive Director of Wisconsin Citizen Action here on the Jeff Santos Show. And, Robert, we heard from Susan Sarandon of her disgust about the fact that Secretary Clinton has not been there, when it's coming fights for fracking, when it's coming fights for Monsanto, when it's coming for fights for TPP. And, a lot of progressives agree. And I have met a lot of people, I know you have too, that feel exactly like her. Now, maybe she'll come around and vote for Hillary Clinton and others if it's not Bernie. But I'm telling you, the power and the passion is with the Sanders campaign. It's not equal. It's not like, there's an equal amount of people who are very passionate for Hillary Clinton, and it's the same thing with Sanders. It's night and day. There are institutional Democrats and those who are tied to the Democratic Party who are for Secretary Clinton. And there's a big difference. Sanders is bringing people in from every aspect, and I think we saw that in the western part of the country. Your thoughts on what the actress Susan Sarandon had to say?
Well, it's kind of interesting to do this from a horse race kind of perspective. I can't believe I'm saying that, since that's all the pundits do, right, is talk about the horse race. But reasonable people can agree or disagree to what extent Hillary Clinton means what she's saying, to what extent you can hold her responsible for her husband's presidency, which was based on a kind of cynical, what he called at the time, triangulation. Like, once you're literally, like, taking that kind of highly pragmatic position and doing welfare reform and doing the crime bill, et cetera, adopting assertive positions, then it's hard for the pivot back to be taken as credible, right? But whatever you believe Hillary will or not do, there's no doubt that it is a political liability, right? That it's a problem for unifying the base, for energizing the Bernie Sanders base, should Hillary Clinton be nominated. And what the big discussion with Susan Sarandon, that panel seemed to be, at least at the beginning of it that you played, Jeff, was whether or not these voters would come around or not, right, which is the big horse race question, or would they tune out because Hillary was the nominee. And I have one little piece of information on that. We have a very hotly contested state Supreme Court race. And the progressive candidate, Joanne Kloppenberg, was in our office yesterday. We have a weekly podcast. She was interviewing for that. And she said she worked the line for the big Sanders rally in Madison over the weekend, and was just going up and down talking to voters. And she said it was an incredibly young, incredibly diverse group. Most of them had never voted before. Most of them were only there and only going to vote because of Bernie Sanders, and that she absolutely believed they did not have a connection, say, to the Democratic Party or the political system necessarily, and might not be there in a fall election. Her concern wasn't that. Her concern was, would they vote in the state Supreme Court race? And she felt like they wouldn't naturally do so unless they were engaged, which is what she was doing. But I think that they're underestimating, some folks on the Democratic establishment side, the extent to which these are new voters that are not engaged in the process and are capable of simply sitting out in the fall.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there are people who are excited about the idea of being part of government, of being involved. It's not like, they're saying, well, Bernie's going to rule everything and we're just going to be his servants. I mean, it's not like that. And that's how a lot of people look at campaigns. They say, oh, well, this is a kind of a family affair, for lack of a better way of explaining it. And I think that the Democratic establishment in Washington and those in the punditocracy, they don't get it. They simply don't understand this. And I think that, it to me, if it comes down and he has more pledged delegates than she does, and they take it away from him because of the superdelegates, what is supposed to happen in Cleveland may happen in Philadelphia, because there are a lot more people who want to see Bernie Sanders president than there are of this idea of the first woman president, which we all would love to see. But the fact is that there's that the excitement level. It goes to 11, to quote our friends from Spinal Tap, when it comes to Bernie Sanders. Maybe at about 6 or 7 when it comes to Secretary Clinton. But, I want to play a cut, Shane, about Ted Cruz, talking about, Wisconsin former Senator Joe McCarthy, with his reincarnation in Mr. Cruz. I want to play that small cut about his agreement with with Governor Walker on who's the problem in Wisconsin. Go right ahead, Shane.
I agree with Governor Walker that Hillary Clinton would make a very poor president. Right. And so on that, we are on the same page. I like Scott Walker. Right. I think he's done a good job standing up to unions in his state.
Standing up to unions in his state, Robert Kraig. Unreal. And 39% approval rating, by the way.
And I have a further quote from him from the Wall Street Journal today on this. Governor Scott Walker is a strong, principled conservative. He added, his Wisconsin battles inspired millions across the country. It inspired me. It showed that when we the people stand together, we can beat the special interests. So we the people was Governor Walker and the Koch brothers, and the special interests were the tens of thousands of people on the streets day after day that were beaten by we the people, apparently. I mean, it's a perfect example of what the Cruz worldview is. I mean, black is white, white is black, up is down, right?
Unreal.
Unbelievable.
It is. He's seen it for the magnifying glass. Black is white, white is black. It's just incredible.
He inspired millionaires, not millions. I think maybe it's a typo, right?
Yes, that's it. He's exactly that. Talking to Robert Kraig here on the Jeff Santos Show. Final minutes. Well, Robert, this should be an amazing week for you and for those who are political observers in the Washington in the Great Wisconsin battleground. And I would think that if the momentum continues, that Bernie Sanders should do very well and pull out a victory there. I guess the question is how much. And of course, it looks like it could be a battle royale with Trump and Cruz and Kasich, who I guess is trying to get some votes upstate toward Green Bay. Is that the game plan for Mr. Kasich?
Yeah, he's been going up to the medium-sized cities, so towards Green Bay, Fox Valley, Wausau, those sort of areas. The problem is this is a very cohesive Republican establishment, very right-wing, and that's now coalesced with Walker behind Cruz. There are very few Kasich supporters, so we'll see if the voters actually are open to Kasich or not. The big contest here is can the establishment get their own voters off of Trump? And Cruz has already raised expectations for Wisconsin. He said that Wisconsin's going to be the beginning of the end for Trump and the beginning of his victory. So this would be devastating for Cruz now if, with the whole establishment behind him, he can't win on Tuesday.
Yeah, it'd be problematic for both of the Republican frontrunners actually, if they fall and they fall badly, and even Mr. Kasich gets a little bit closer. You may end up with about 24 or 25% when it's over, I think. It's going to be fascinating, my friend. That's for sure. And there are town halls and a whole slew of one-on-one interviews that CNN and MSNBC are doing. So it's going to be fascinating. Robert Kraig, Wisconsin Citizen Action. Thank you, sir. Always great checking in. Enjoy the next week.
Always great to talk to you, Jeff. And we'll see. Trump has threatened to pull out tonight from the CNN town hall. We'll see.
Oh, awesome. I love it. More and more controversies. I love it. All the best, Robert. We'll talk to you on Election Day next week. I want to thank Shane for producing the broadcast, with Sarah Billingsley doing the great job on the web. Our great work of interns today, Katie Nakora in her second day with the program. And I want to thank Jessica for her work as well, Philippa. And, of course, our great TV guys, Gio and Freddie Santori, Jack Casey, D. Simpson right here in Emerson. Folks, keep on fighting. Keep on fighting. My name is Jeff Santos, and I gotta go! It's a beautiful day. We have lots to talk about. I want to get into this issue of the Trump candidacy at large and connect it a little bit to where Bernie Sanders is with the media. We spoke a little bit yesterday with Steve Chagris of CBS News. Again, I give them a lot of credit because they have actually covered this and not focused on the, in my opinion, the sort of gutterball way and horse race way of following politics. They've given Bernie Sanders a good shot. They've given Mr. Kasich from Ohio, the governor there, a good shot, who probably will do well, may not necessarily win Wisconsin. And that's somewhat of the problem for him going forward if they're going to try to get behind him in Cleveland. But there is no doubt that the media created Donald Trump. And, I mean, the Republican Party has veered off to the extreme right to begin with. But the American media, primarily the major networks in the morning, ABC, NBC, CBS, with their morning shows, and then, of course, MS and CNN, have given him tremendous amount of coverage. Now, what I think is going to be interesting is to see whether or not they go after this case of Landowski, and whether or not they are going to, look to bury Trump, because, now we're dealing about violence toward reporters, which, of course, MSNBC is part of, having female reporters cover Donald Trump. I think it's Katie Tur. You also have a scenario where, you're attacking media And that also is something that I don't think is going to last very long with, the establishment media. So it's going to be interesting now to see how they approach this. Is it going to be one of these scenarios where, this guy is not only not qualified, we heard it from other reports this week that he doesn't know a lot about foreign policy. Well, that's no breaking news. He gets his news from the Meet the Press and Sunday shows. That's what he said. But what I think is going to be important here is this going to be sort of, we're going to give one for the good old team here, and we're going to protect our journalists and protect our reputation, and we're not going to let just reporters, get abused. I believe, and I think that there is something here that is going to be interesting because the difference with Trump and say Bernie Sanders is that with Trump, he is the outsider taking on the establishment, but he is also part of the establishment of the world of Wall Street, real estate, right? He's a mogul. So a little bit different than, Mr. Sanders, who takes his salary and takes $30 from donors, doesn't have Wall Street, knocking on his door, and he's not knocking on theirs. But what I think is interesting here is, so you have Trump and his world. He knows all the executives at all the networks by first name. He calls them up, Roger, Steve, all this stuff, right? Now, is he going to be able to sort of push back against these networks as he was trying to get an apology from the MSNBC reporter, Ms. Turr, when asked a question earlier this month about the fact that, if Corey, the campaign manager, is found innocent, are you going to apologize to him as if it's her fault? She's bringing up the news. So what we have is a case of the big media, the presidents of the media corporations who know Donald Trump. They make about the same amount of money, maybe a little bit less if you're head of a news division. And it just seems to me that what we're dealing with here are people who are reporters, people who are, the producers, some who make under six figures. And are they going to be the ones that are pushing this news story, or are you going to have it from the top? Now, on the other side, of course, is you have Hillary Clinton is the establishment, and she is tied in with the media. We see it every day. Just the fact that they put the superdelegates in there, they don't decipher the difference between allocated, pledged delegates and superdelegates. They shouldn't be even talking about superdelegates, but they do. So there is a difference here, and it's going to be interesting to see whether or not Trump, which has given them more ratings, which therefore sells more cars and beer and everything else that they sell on television these days, whether they will basically try to destroy this with help from the Republicans in the Stop Trump campaign, because they know that he is an albatross to them when it comes to female voters. And are they going to be doing everything in their power to make sure that the networks keep up this story about the campaign manager? Now, I have seen members of the parliament in Japan fight. There have been a lot worse scenarios than what happened here. But it is easy to make the analogy after all of the violence that has occurred, particularly the 80-year-old man taking the cheap shot at the African-American kid who was protesting there, sucker punched him, and all the other issues that have gone on in Chicago and a lot of other places where there's been this sort of element of violence toward reporters by Trump's secret service groups. And I'm just wondering if this is going to develop into an issue where the Democratic Party gets shoved off over the next 3 or 4 days. Again, Bernie Sanders is just coming off 3 big victories, 5 of the last 6. And now he's having to say, well, the road is so hard, the math is so difficult. Now we have this controversy, and maybe it doesn't mean that much to Sanders because a lot of his people, I think, don't watch the networks as much as we do here in the media. But thank God in some ways, because it's been biased in favor of Clinton and in favor of the Republicans. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. We want to hear from you. 772-925-8206. That's the phone number to join us. Email me, Jeff@revolutionboston.com, and check us out, Facebook and Twitter @Jeff Santos Show. We're back in a flash.